This is TWiT.
We've got a great guest. We've got Mr. Brett Hansen. He is the VP of Data Security Solutions at Dell. Brett, we have you by audio only. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, GDPR, we talked about it briefly on TWiT a couple of weeks ago when it looked like it was making its final push. Of course, this is a way to protect data by putting certain obligations on the companies that use consumer data. Can you summarize what GDPR is in the eyes of Dell?
Well, General Data Protection Regulation is the consolidation of multiple different existing laws underneath one broader framework for all EU countries around how do you have to protect your employees and customer personal data. What makes it unique is the fact it is not just for those companies who exist in the EU, it is for anyone who is doing business in the EU. So it extends beyond just the borders of Europe.
Now, in one of the commentaries I read about this, they admitted that there's been many attempts at this. There's been little regulations about consumer privacy and data privacy and what you can and cannot do with that. And someone said, well, what you need is you need regulations that have teeth. Unless they have teeth, you're never going to get results. What are the teeth in the GDPR?
Well, it's pretty straightforward. It's 20 million euros or 4% of the annual revenue. So I would say those have some fangs there.
Right. And what I love about that is that sliding scale, because so often we've heard something egregious, some breach of data where the fine is $4 million out of billions. But that sliding scale is to say, no, we can make this hurt. It's based on how big you are and how much you lose. So, for example, when we first did this story, we were talking about the Marriott breach and how Marriott has been very blasé with their security, how they've lost customer data multiple times, even though they've been fined. And it was because they were fined $20,000, $40,000, $100,000, even though the breaches involved, again, tens or hundreds of billions. With something like GDPR, could you do the same thing in the United States, or is our corporate culture completely different?
Well, I think that there is an increasing awareness of the importance of personal data. So hopefully we're going to see more companies start to look at how they can protect data. Again, many large corporations in the United States, including Dell, we have activities in the EU. So we're already having to take the steps to address GDPR. And so it's a natural, logical extension to say, okay, well, let's keep going in the United States as well. Your opening segment was on Equifax. It's a great example of where there is opportunities for us to take a harder line and more focus around protecting data.
Right. And we'll be getting back to Equifax in just a bit, but I also wanted to draw out the point that it's not just teeth. It's not just that there's finally a financial penalty that will hurt. There's also a transparency obligation here. And we've talked a lot about that on This Week in Enterprise Tech. Chibert and I like to call it 100% transparent failure. That's something that we got from Dan Gear at a Black Hat keynote, where companies need to tell us in a timely fashion. They can't sit on something for months and months and months, or even in a couple of cases, years, before they finally decide it's the right time for them to announce that their company was breached. What's the obligation under the GDPR? If I'm running a 10,000-seat enterprise and I've just lost a cache of consumer data, what's my obligation? How much time do I have before I have to come clean?
Well, it's 30 days is the quick answer to that. And it's the key here is that, as you called out, the GDPR approach is being much more thoughtful than anything we've seen before around addressing the timeliness, having the regulation that has some real teeth to it in terms of the fine, but also the comprehensive nation, right? We're looking at any sort of personal identifiable information, whether again that is a customer or an employee, and that's a powerful statement to say, we care about making sure the data is being protected, and more companies need to be thinking about this.
Right. You alluded to Equifax, and you did a callback to its place at the top of the show. When we talk about Equifax, it brings up a lot of anger just because it was a huge breach and really nothing has happened. They haven't really been punished. They've actually gotten more revenue than they had year over year. and the very minimal probing that Congress was going to do has been shut down. What would something like a U.S. version of GDPR, so not just the European version that has to be met by American companies doing business in the EU, but perhaps our own version of the rules, what would it do to a company like Equifax that has lost so many of its records, that has basically violated the trust that was placed in them and really didn't do anything to recover from it?
Well, I think that the first piece was, as we've talked about, there are some fines. And as you called out very well, there's a sliding scale that, as the size of the company goes up and the breach goes up, there's going to be some real penalties applied to this. The other piece of this is just what I've seen from companies who I've spoken with is it raises awareness. Data security is a relatively new thing, right? It's not been around for 25, 30 years. It's been the last few years. And so more companies are starting to look at GDPR, look at the regulations, look at the mindset, and then say, okay, what do we need to do to better protect ourselves? And thinking about data in a broader sense than just what's in my data center, it's also what's on my endpoints. How are my employees accessing? Who should be accessing? So the great thing about GDPR is raising the conversation, raising the investigation around how do we protect personal data, which should be a top of mind for all companies.